I remember when I turned 40, my dad was 80, and I talked to him on my 40th birthday, and I said, "Well, I finally reached middle age." And he said, "You don't know that."
Hello, and welcome to the 100th episode of the 40 Drinks Podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie McLaughlin. You know, sometime in the years around our 40th birthday, many of us start to feel what I call the ick, like some part of our life that was going along smoothly no longer is, and you don't know what to do about it. I know that was true for me, and I fought against it, which only made it a messier process. But having 40 drinks with 40 people over the course of a year helped me escape the influence of that ick. On this podcast, I welcome you to tap into my stories and experience, as well as those of my guests, to help you emerge from your own ick and maybe even avoid some of the mistakes we made along the way. My mission is to make it common cultural knowledge that there is a transition most of us face around age 40, and then showcase so many versions of that transition that every single person approaching or recently turned 40 with dread in their heart knows that they are not alone. Today, my guest is Adrian Walker, a weekly columnist and associate editor at the Boston Globe and host of the wildly popular and award-winning true crime podcast, Murder in Boston, which dropped in December 2023. In addition to this, Adrian is my best friend of more than 30 years, who once wrote a Boston Globe column about my pet turtle being called for jury duty. He is also the person responsible for pushing me over the hump to do the original 40 Drinks project, which ultimately turned into this podcast. I could think of nobody better to be here with me to celebrate my 100th episode. Welcome to the podcast, my love.
Well, thank you.
So you and I have known each other for a very long time now. If I remember correctly, I think we met in 1991.
That sounds right.
Do you remember
Somewhere
when
in
we
there.
met? Do you remember how we met?
You've always said we met at Fenway Park.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, we were at Fenway Park.
I think I was with Jim Sullivan.
Sounds right.
Let me add some context for people who are listening. So back when I was 20 and a co-op for the Boston Globe, this was in 1991, and there was a whole crowd of reporters in their late 20s, and fraternization between the ranks was quite, what's a good word for it? Quite active, not frowned upon at that point in time. So going out for drinks and going out for a ball game with one of the late 20s reporters was just something that happened. I think it's not quite as prevalent today.
It's less common, I think.
Yeah, so I was out for the baseball game with the rock and roll critic at the time and saw you out on the concourse somewhere. And if I remember correctly, you stopped me and you said, "Hey, I know you," because you'd seen me around the building. And
Yes, that's
thus
right.
began a long and illustrious story of friendship.
Yes, that's how it all started.
That's how it all started. So, normally I talk to people about the transition around age 40, and you and I both have some recollection of the party for you for your 40th birthday. Do you have any kind of inclination or inkling that there was a transition for you sometime in your 40s? Does that
Yeah, I think
resonate
the
at all?
milestone for me was more like late 30s. It was a little
Okay.
before I turned 40. I remember that I got my dream job, the column, when I was 36. And then I bought my sports car when I was 38 or 39, my two-seater roadster. And I think that was
Yeah.
sort of the middle-age transition for me. It didn't quite
Okay.
line up with turning 40. Although I remember turning 40 was kind of a thing. It felt a lot older than 39 for
Yeah.
some reason. I remember I'm a twin. I have a twin sister. And I remember we
Yeah.
decided we wanted to turn 40 together, having spent most of our adult birthdays apart. So we turned 40 together in New York, and then the party you remember was the next weekend.
Yeah, your transition is perfectly in line with a lot of the other people that I've talked to and all the research that I've done. It's sort of that decade between 35 and 45. And I forgot that you got your dream job at 36.
Yeah.
I mean, that's perfectly on time for the transition. I started my business when I was 36. So, yeah. One thing I didn't know about you today until earlier this afternoon was you have a Wikipedia page.
Yeah, and I don't know why I have it because I didn't start it. I stumbled on it at some point and fact checked it, but I don't know who put it up.
I was like, Holy shit, they don't give those out. You got to be like legit. Our favorite phrase comes into play again because today you are cooler than you were yesterday, as far as I'm concerned, because you have your own Wikipedia
I
page.
don't know where it came
Oh,
from, and I don't even remember how I happened to find out it existed, but I did. And then when I read it, like half of it was wrong, and
oh,
I
really?
figured out how to go fix it.
Well, it's pretty impressive. So we've talked a little bit about your transition. You said 40 felt really much older than 39. How so?
I don't know, it just seemed like a big number. I remember
Yeah.
when before I turned 30, when I was 29, one of my friends said to me, well, 30 won't seem like a big deal when it gets there because you've had a whole year to think about it, which was true.
Hmm.
But turning 40 was a
Hmm.
little different. Turning 40, it felt more like a milestone than 30 did.
Yeah. All the literature that I have read and the research I've done, it says that 40 is the first age where people actually start to feel quote unquote old, right? They think that's the first age that you're quote unquote old.
Yeah, I think that's true. I remember when I turned
It-
40, my dad was 80, and I talked to him on my 40th birthday, and I said, well, I finally reached middle age. And he said, you don't know that.
oh, that's a riot. To his point, you still don't know.
I'm not gonna know, which is fine. Somebody will know, but it won't be me.
Tell me how you remember me in my early 20s.
How I remember you in your early 20s? Very smart, very ambitious. You always had a lot going on. You often had like two jobs. Like I remember when you worked for us in City Hall, you wanted to leave early because you had to get to your other job at the Gap. And you had a lot of drive.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I also liked to let loose a lot.
Yes.
It was like an equal and opposite reaction, I think. I was exceptionally driven and then partied to the exceptional end on the
Yes.
other end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
You said something to me recently. We were out for dinner a couple of months ago, and I was telling you a story. I had been talking to a friend, and she and I had been talking about sort of looking back at our own younger years and me sort of realizing more recently that there were things that had affected me as a younger person that I had no idea about, childhood traumas and things like that. And I said, I never knew until, recently that I had childhood trauma. And you said something really definitive, like, yeah, I know you didn't, or something like that. Was it obvious to you?
I don't know if it was obvious to me, but when I heard it, I wasn't surprised. But I think you've always kind of had this quality of not being affected by anything. You always just like
Oh,
kind of soldiered right through whatever you were going through until relatively recently. But I would say that's how you were
right.
for a long time. Like you didn't believe in shit like depression or anything like that. It's get up and get moving, I think. And that's kind of how you've always been. So I wasn't
Yeah.
surprised that it took you by surprise, if that makes sense.
No, that makes huge sense, and I love it. I love the reflection back because it's so hard to see ourselves from the outside, right? And I honestly have not been an introspective person until the last couple of years working through this podcast and this process and these interviews with people. I mean, even for a decade or more, I've done personal growth kind of stuff, but I've never really been that naturally introspective. And so a lot have sort of taken me by surprise. Things that I relate to, things that I resonate with has taken me by surprise during the last couple of years as I've been doing this podcast.
It's been interesting to watch you get more introspective because it really was something like you just did not do for a long time. You didn't do
Yeah,
introspection.
right. What's to be found there? What's to
Right.
bother with? Just keep
Why don't
going.
you stop gazing at your navel and go do something?
Right. Is there something to be accomplished or a party to be joined?
That's right.
Yeah.
I have to say, I'm,
That's
I'm
so
not the world's
interesting.
most introspective person either.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. What do you think has really spoken for the longevity of our friendship? Cuz I feel like I've had friends that have passed through my life, you've had people that have passed through your life, and yet for 30 something years, 1991, 30 what? 3 years? 30 freaking 3 years?
By far my longest standing close friendship. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I don't
Do you have
know.
any idea why?
I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. I don't know because I feel like I have been as involved with you as I've been with any of my other friends by depth of attachment and the stuff that we do together. We hang out. For decades, you and I partied a lot together. And since neither of us party as much anymore, we've stayed in alignment there. So it's interesting that it's something that I've thought about over the years, literally for decades, especially as people sort of pass through my life and friendships come and go. It's like, how is it that she just wandered off or he wandered off, and yet you and I are still
Yeah, usually people drift
steady as
apart, and especially when people aren't like physically in proximity with each other anymore. Like when somebody
yeah.
moves away, like you moving home, that's usually the beginning of the end. But with us, it just never
Yeah,
happened that way.
it never
We
was.
just
I
never like
know.
stop picking up the phone and checking in and staying in touch,
Yeah.
talking to each other.
Yeah.
It's like we never
Yeah.
stopped making that effort.
Yeah, I think for the first decade I moved home. So I moved home in 2001. And I've said this before, but for people who are listening, I live an hour north of Boston. Adrian's in Boston. And for the first decade I moved home, I mean, I came and stayed with you maybe once a month.
Yeah, right.
We had a whole routine. I mean, I'd drive down on a Friday night and we'd go out and crash out on the couch on, Fridays or Saturdays or sometimes both. It was really kind of crazy. Do you remember we used to go to hang out at Anchovies on, I think it was on Friday nights, and one of your good pals worked at the bar?
Mike
He didn't own
Parker
it.
was the bartender.
Michael Parker.
Yes.
And his sister owned it.
Your sister owned it. Yes.
I remember for a period in time, he said, I was like the local who lived furthest away.
Yes, that's right.
How can you live 50 miles away from a
Yeah.
bar and still be a
You
local?
were the regular who lived 50 miles away.
Right. Yeah, those were great times. So for a long time, we kept up our same routines.
Yes.
And that was back when I've talked about this throughout the podcast and on different conversations about how much I used to drink and how much I used to party. And like you said earlier, a lot of that was done with you. We did that together. We were partners in crime for a very long time that way. And those were fun times.
They were fun times.
Yeah. I look back upon them fondly. Do you still?
I do. Yes. Now,
Yeah.
for me, it's a little different. They were fun times, and then after a while, they weren't fun times. Not the times with you,
Right.
but just the drinking times in general.
Yeah. Because you quit drinking a couple of years ago, 9 years.
I got sober 9 years ago.
Yeah. We were out over the winter, I think. You and I, it wasn't too long ago. We had gone to a show or something, and then we walked over to Anchovies again to
That's
see
right.
if we couldn't recreate the magic for a minute or two. And the place was mobbed like it never used to be back in the day. And we started chatting with this really sweet young gal who came over and chatted with us. And we were both having sparkling water. And I forget, she said something about it. And what did you say? I said, I was retired. And you said something else. I said we were retired. You said one of us is retired and one of us is
It could have
recovering
been.
or something like that. It was just such a fabulous description.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can't remake the magic of those days, of those times.
Yeah.
So the other wonderful thing about the 40 Drinks podcast and having you here is that none of this would exist without you.
How so?
Well, the 40 Drinks project was something I decided to do when I turned 40. And I was in a part of my life where I had been dumped by another terrible boyfriend. I think I had been dumped over text. Just coming up to my 40th birthday, it was like I didn't want to have a big party. That who was going to come and who was going to throw it? Where was it going to be? It was all so gross. So I had this crazy idea to have 40 drinks with 40 people. It was July, a month before my birthday, and you and I were going to a Red Sox game. So I came down to the city and we had dinner at Eastern Standard. And I was telling you all about my crazy idea. And you said, I love it. You're always so supportive of my crazy ideas. And then a few minutes later, you pointed at the menu and you slid the cocktail menu over to me and you said, hey, look at this. And I remember just thinking, not really in the mood for a rum drink. And you were like, no, look at the name. And do you remember what it was?
Yes, I did.
What was it?
Periodista.
And why would that drink have had some thematic connection between you and I and our relationship?
And it was named after a newspaper or something.
It was a Spanish word for journalist that had its roots in Miami during the Cuban Missile Crisis or something.
Yeah.
And so it was like, here you are, you're a journalist, you're originally from Miami, and we're trying to do this drink thing for thematic connections. And it was like, all right, let's order the drink. I started almost by accident because of your support of the crazy idea and your camaraderie over the whole thing. So really, this whole crazy thing
How about that?
got started with you.
Yeah, you decided you wanted to have 40 drinks with 40 friends.
Yeah, in 40 different places.
I remember we started making
And
a
then,
list.
yeah. So that's why I knew you had to be my guest for episode number 100. Because, number 100, there's all so much beautiful magic in those numbers.
That's right.
So let's talk a little bit about, you said something a couple minutes ago, you got sober a few years ago. And since you've done that, you have worked on a couple of really cool projects at work.
Yes.
Hi, we'll get back to the conversation in just a minute. I wanted to note 3 things today in this special 100th episode. Moving forward, I sincerely want to engage more with you, the listeners. So, number 1, I want to say explicitly that I want to hear from you, and I want you to feel really welcome to ask me questions. Ask me anything you ever wanted to know about turning 40, about this transition that most of us go through during this period of time, or about what my guests have shared of their stories or what I've shared of mine. I also wanted to say out loud, because I don't do it enough, that if you want to learn more about the 40 transition, please consider getting on my email list, where I explore the topic in different ways than I do here in my guest episodes. And finally, if there's anything you'd like to see or hear more of on the 40 Drinks podcast, I am open to your suggestions. I'm proud of making it to 100 episodes, but my biggest goal for this podcast is to be a resource for those of you going through the transition. So if there's something else that might be useful to you, please let me know. You can do all of that on my website, 40drinks.com, and don't forget to spell out the word 40. There is a contact button right at the top of the page if you want to drop me a line, and there is a subscribe button as well right there at the top if you want to get on that email list. And as per usual, if you're enjoying today's conversation, hit subscribe, leave a review, or share this episode with someone who you think might appreciate this exploration of life's twists and turns. All right, back to Adrian. Let's talk about those. What was the first one?
Let's see. So I work at the Boston Globe. I write for the Boston Globe, and we did a project in 2017 on racism in Boston, Boston Race Image Reality. Ended up being a 7-part series that I did as part of the Globe Spotlight team. And yeah, I'd never done a project like that before, and it turned out to be a big success.
Huge success. Yeah. Like, I found out on Wikipedia today that it was Pulitzer Prize finalist success.
Yes, it was. You knew that. You just forgot.
You're probably right. I'm sure you're right.
You used to know that.
Okay, I used to know that. That's a good way to say that.
And I did one just recently, revisiting the Charles Stewart murder case, called Murder in Boston. It became a 9-part podcast. There's a documentary on HBO and an 8-part series in the paper. So it was a sprawling, ambitious thing.
Yeah, it was pretty fucking cool.
Thank you.
I mean, really. I just can't describe to you what it's like to be watching HBO and then all of a sudden to have your best friend on the screen. My husband will attest that I scream when it happens.
The funny thing is that I've barely seen it.
Oh my God. It's so good.
Yeah. I mean, I
and you're
saw
so
it
good
before it aired because we had to watch it.
Right. But yeah, this whole project, this new project, the Charles Stewart murder, the newspaper part of the project was something that you were familiar with because you had done the Race in Boston project a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And the HBO piece was something you were familiar with because you've been a guest on a couple of other documentaries.
Yes.
But the podcast piece was brand new for you.
I had never done a podcast and hardly listened to any, with the exception, obviously, of 40 Drinks. But, I'd listen to a podcast a little bit here and there, but not a ton. We're sitting there one day and they said, hey, we want you to host the podcast. And, not knowing any better, I said, yeah, okay. I have no idea what this would entail. A year later, I'm in a recording studio, recording episode 1.
Wow.
Yeah.
And the podcast did pretty darn well, don't you think?
The podcast is done well. I think it's the best of the 3 versions of the story. I think it's easily the best one, the most interesting one. Yeah, it's done really well. It dropped in early December.
And so, like 4 months, 4 or 5 months, you've got 1.5 million downloads.
Yes.
And for weeks, you were in like the top podcasts in the world.
It was a hit.
It was a hit.
It was a hit.
Yes. Yeah. That is so cool. Is it something you think you'd do again?
Yes, although not at, the next one can't take 2 years. I'm too old for that. But yeah, I'm open to hosting another podcast. Sure.
For anybody who hasn't listened to Murder in Boston, please go check it out because you did just such a great job of hosting it. You sounded like you'd been doing it forever.
What's funny is that I can listen to it for about 15 minutes at a time. And then it's like I got to turn it off and go do something else.
Why
I
that?
have a really hard time. It's just like listening to myself just feels weird. I can't quite explain it.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, when we were in the process of doing it, I had to sit down and listen to the episodes as they were completed. What's happened is that I've done a bunch of interviews about it, and I'm starting to forget little details, which bothers me. So I said the other day, I'm going to sit down and just listen to the whole thing, start to finish, which would take maybe 6 hours. And I couldn't do it.
Was it because of listening to your own voice?
I just have this weird, mix of emotions about it. Partly I'm really proud of it because it's really good, but it also just makes me very self-conscious.
Sure. Wow. Well, it is really good. And I was just so proud of you and just so proud to be your friend. Like when that whole thing was coming out, because it was a hit. There was like, what, 8 people on the team? And of course, I've been around for the 2 years behind the scenes, so I know exactly how much work you put into it. So, of course, these things come out looking beautiful and polished and like it was easy, but
yeah, it was a heavy lift.
There was a lot of gestation of that project. Yes.
I always say I thought it would take a year. It took 2.5 years.
Well, I always say like the podcast too. It's like the old adage about having a baby, right? If I had known how much work it was before I did it, I might not have done it.
Right, exactly.
Not that either you or I have babies, but I've heard people say that.
I get the idea.
Right. Any projects up for you on the horizon? Do you have anything you're thinking of doing?
I have something I'm thinking of doing. It's not going to be a podcast, but I have an idea for a little series of columns.
Okay. All right. I am trying to get you to do another podcast because I think you'd be amazing at it.
Like I said, I'm definitely open to it. So there was a big narrative journalism conference at BU a few weeks ago, where Brian McGrory is now chair of the journalism department. And we did a panel. 3 of us from our project did the opening night, big event, did a panel. And then the next night, Brian had this dinner with Dean McKay, the former editor of the New York Times. And, there were a bunch of BU professors and a few students there. So we're there in this private room at Eastern Standard. And Brian and I are talking, and these 3 students come up to me and they go, "Mr. Walker, it was so wonderful to meet you. Your voice was so beautiful, and we love the podcast so much." And Brian is standing there just dying. Like, "Oh my God, do you have to tell him how great he is?" I'm like, this is a great moment.
It just cracks me up. And this is one of the things, like, as you get older, because the people that you knew and you came up with and you grew up with, become people of some stature, AKA Brian McGrory, who spent was it a decade? He was the
10 or 11 years. Yeah.
10 or 11 years as the editor-in-chief of the Boston Globe. I mean, that's pretty impressive. And when I was 20, I used to follow him around like a puppy dog. I had the biggest crush on him, as you know.
Yes, I recall.
Classic.
As long as we're telling stories, remember the day we went to Lockover?
Yes. So Lockover was a very traditional Brahmin restaurant in Boston. Like the Kennedys would go there and, all the political bigwigs. It was not far from the State House. And you and I worked in City Hall at the time. I think you were the bureau chief at the time and I was your co-op. And we would go out for lunches and we would go out for dinners and we would go out for drinks. We would do all kinds of stuff. But at one point I said to you, I want to go to Lockover. I don't remember why, but we just decided that it would be fun to go to Lockover. And I remember I came in that day and I was wearing, a cute little black dress, with tights. And I'm sure, who knows how old I was, 21, 22. And so you and I walked ourselves over to Lockover. Did we have a reservation? Did you make a reservation?
I don't think so.
We just walked in. And this is like the power lunch spot. This is in the early 90s. So
Yeah.
major power lunch vibes.
Yeah. I'm in my suit. I'm in a suit and tie. You're in your little black dress. We're all dressed up.
Yep. And so we walk in and say, "We're here for lunch. 2 for lunch, please." And then what?
So there was this big dining room with a bar in it. It's crowded, but it's not full. And I think they're going to seat us there. And instead, the host starts taking us upstairs and tries to put us in this empty private room. And I look around at this empty room and I'm like, we're not sitting up here. We're going to sit downstairs with everybody else. And made him take us back down.
Yeah. And you and I always suspected
I would
that
call
it
it more than a
was.
suspicion.
Well, it was funny. I was just going to say, flash forward to 2017 when he does the Race in Boston series. A cute little white girl and a black man out for lunch. We don't think they wanted that scene in their dining room.
I think we weren't the vibe.
Yeah. And I just have always been so glad that you spoke up and said no.
Yeah, no. We're not doing this.
We're not doing this. No. Because, we were there for the power lunch.
That's right. Absolutely.
There were plenty of other times where you and I had a room to ourselves. And that was when we would go to, what was the place in Faneuil Hall we would go to lunch?
I remember, I can't think of the name of it. It was something nautical, but I'm blanking on the name of it.
And then you went upstairs and there was this tiny little bar upstairs, like maybe like a 6-seater bar or something.
Yes.
And I remember you and I sitting in that room by ourselves.
Yeah.
Do you remember the one like classic day that we went out for lunch?
Yeah, we went out for lunch and never went back.
But it's better than that. We went out for lunch. We had lunch. And then we said, let's go upstairs and have a drink. And so we went upstairs and we had a drink. So we probably went to lunch at noon, maybe 1. Went upstairs and had a drink. And I don't think we sat there all night. We must have gone other places. But next thing you know, it was like 11:30 at night. And we went to McDonald's. We needed fries. We needed to soak up some of the booze. And then we went back into City Hall to go grab our bags.
I think you had like lucky or something. I think you were going home for the weekend or something.
I can't have been if we were drinking till 11 o'clock. I must have just gotten the train back to my apartment. Yeah. I like to tell people, when I went to college, I went pro drinking.
Yes, you did.
Stories like that kind of prove it. Yeah.
Well, then you did a semester in Ireland and you came back a whiskey drinker.
I did. Well, because I never drank beer.
Right.
Never once.
Never liked beer.
So it was like, if you're going to go to Ireland, what are you going to drink if you can't drink beer? Yeah. Well, whiskey and cider. Because they also, back in the early 90s, they didn't really do much in the way of mixed drinks. Like, I remember ordering a drink in my first week there or something. I was like, could I have a this and a that? And they poured the booze in a glass and then gave me this little 6-ounce pineapple juice on the side. Like, they weren't even going to make the cocktail for you. Like, it was that bad. So yeah, I'm going to Ireland again this summer for the first time in 30 years. So I'll see whether or not cocktail culture has made it over there. I'm sure it has, but it wasn't at the time. So I drank cider and I drank whiskey, lots and lots of whiskey.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember coming back and being able to tell the difference between different ages of Bushmills, because
you were very well informed when you got back.
Oh, dear.
You knew about barrels and different cans of barrels.
Exactly. We had so much fun in the 90s. Oh, my God. What a time. Oh, my goodness. So I'm thinking back to our first drink for the 40 Drinks Project, and I'm thinking back to the blog post that I wrote. So when I did the 40 Drinks Project, I put up a little website and I wrote all these blog posts about, every person I had a drink with and the relationship and the drink and all of that stuff. And the story that I told in my blog post about you was from maybe a couple of years later than that, because I was co-oping in the newsroom at that point. So it was very close to my graduating college. I think it might have been like 1994. And you were going out to cover a story and I went with you. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Let's tell that story.
So the St. Patrick's Day parade in Southie had been canceled or something like that. And this white nationalist from Mississippi decided he was going to go to South Boston and lead a parade around South Boston area. And for some forgotten reason, I decided I wanted to cover this crazy white supremacist parade in South Boston. And you decided you wanted to come along. So there we were, there on a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and I guess it was March of, I don't know, 94 or 95, something like that. And there was a bigger crowd than expected, and things got a little hairy. Yes.
So when we got there, we were ushered into an area that had been cordoned off for the press. We were right across the street from South Boston High, and there was a huge police presence. There was a huge community presence. And obviously, this is being led by a white supremacist. So there was, nods to old South Boston and racism and white supremacy and all of that stuff. So during the march, we were quite well protected in this area for the press. And then you got what you needed to get. And so you said, let's go. And so we leave this area and start walking back towards your car. And we're on a crowded sidewalk. And within steps from the press area, the crowd had separated us and was jostling us. And we were becoming part of the melee, not of our own accord. Yes. I remember getting separated from you, and it was very scary. It was scary for both of us. I mean, I think maybe more so for you, but for me as well. It was a charged atmosphere.
Yes, absolutely. I remember the crowd just sort of starting to collapse in on top of me.
Yeah. So we grabbed each other again and went back into that press area.
Oh, that's right.
Luckily we were only a couple of steps away. I mean, we hadn't made it far. Yeah. And you flagged down one of the police. What was he? A captain or
his name is Bobby O'Toole.
Here's what I remember about Bobby O'Toole. I remember his cufflinks.
That's right.
His cufflinks were REOT.
That's right. Yes.
And for some reason, whenever I think of his cufflinks, I think of Perot, but it's not quite right. But you told him what happened.
Yeah.
And he said, all right, don't worry about it. And so he grabbed 6 guys in full riot gear.
Yes. Shields and billy clubs. And they escorted us.
They put us in the middle of the 6 of them. And they escorted us, shields and clubs, up a block or two away to where we were parked. We got in the car. We made it back to the Globe. You were writing your story. We were both quite shaken up. But that was the day that you came up with our forever line, which is, you said to me, well, pal, today we are cooler than we were yesterday. For having survived, I don't even know what would you have called it? It wasn't a riot, but it was pretty close.
Yeah. Melee was a good word. Yeah. It was kind of crazy.
Yeah. I think those are some of our highlights for sure. The only other one I can think of that's a real highlight is going to Burger King after being out at the bars drinking for a million years. And now you and I both know, we can both caveat this and say, we know we shouldn't have been doing this.
Yes.
But we'd go to Burger King and we'd go to the drive-thru, and all I remember is driving back to your house, the couple of blocks, and holding my French fries out the window because they were too hot. Yeah. If you held them out the window for a block or so, then you could eat them.
Yes.
Oh, we had some good times, my love.
Yes, we had tons of fun.
We still have fun. Are you kidding? About a year ago, I schnookered you. For a couple of years, you've been a season ticket holder at the Boston Ballet. And I said to you last year, why don't you buy a second ticket? Because then you could take friends with you to the ballet. You could take people with you.
Yeah. Why go by yourself?
Why go by yourself? And it has quite turned out to be my ticket. So, in fact, we're going this weekend.
We are going this weekend.
Yes. And that's been fun. So that's sort of one of our new things is I'll come down into town and we'll go out to a fancy dinner and then go to the ballet.
Yes.
Which is a blast. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me on my podcast, for being my 100th guest.
What an honor.
It is. It's an honor for me too. I think one of the fun things in today's conversation has been giving people a bit of a picture window into some of my hijinks as a younger person, some of the things that
You
some
had
of my formative experiences, which don't often come up because, I'm not talking to people who know me well and we're mostly talking about them. So this has been a lot of fun.
you had your hijinks for sure.
I did.
I can
I
attest.
did. I was queen of hijinks for quite a while.
Yes, exactly.
All right, my love. Thank you.
Alrighty.
Thanks so much for listening today. It was so much fun, as I'm sure you could tell, to have my very best friend on the show with me. That is really kind of what it's like to hang out with me and Adrian. We are just laughing and giggling all the time. And I know this was a little different than what I usually do. And I think you probably got a little bit more insight about me as much as you did about Adrian and his transition around age 40. And I realized as I was recording the introduction for this episode that Adrian and I didn't even cover one of our very best stories, which is the time my pet turtle got called for jury duty. But that's the challenge. We have so many great stories. So let me fill in that little hole for you. When I was a freshman in college, a boyfriend who has the great distinction of being referred to as the Antichrist, the only good thing about him was that he bought me a pet tortoise. So I had this turtle for almost 20 years before he passed, but his name was Maximilian Schell, named, of course, after the great German actor. And years later, when I was living in Boston, there were periods of time where I was living on my own. But, as a young woman in the big city, you don't really want to be seen as being on your own. So I would record my outgoing voicemail message that says, "Hi, it's Steph and Max. We can't get to the phone right now." And I would also put his name, because he had a first and a last name, I put his name on my mailbox. And one of my girlfriends was pretty silly, and she used to actually send Max postcards. So Max needed his name on the mailbox. Well, one day I got a piece of mail from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that was calling Max in for jury duty, which I thought was hysterical. So, of course, I call Adrian. I tell him about it. And he says, "This is a column." And I was like, "Are you kidding me?" And he said no. So I tell him everything I know about this whole thing. And so he goes back and he does the reporting on how this happens. So he calls the state, and the state tells him that they got this list from the city. So he calls the city. And one thing I think maybe you don't know about me yet is that I spent 5 years working for Tom Menino when he was mayor of Boston. And this was shortly thereafter. So when Adrian called the city, the person who was the election commissioner at that point said, "Is this our Stephanie McLaughlin?" And he said, "Yeah, it is." And she said to him, "Why is she doing this to us?" And he said, "She's not. I am." And so what happened was somebody from the city took a census from the buildings. And what they did was they walked into the buildings and just looked at the names on the mailboxes and sort of went, "Yep, those are the humans who live here." And they went to the city, and the city certified the list and sent it to the state, which then used that list to call Max for jury duty. So Adrian wrote this great column about Max being called for jury duty, and it was pretty hysterical. It hit the Boston Globe. Gosh, I don't even know what year this was. It was definitely in the 90s, maybe 2000. And on the morning of that being published, I got calls from all over. I think that day I did interviews with like 2 or 3 of the networks in Boston. And over the next couple of weeks, I did radio interviews as far away as BBC London and like NPR Seattle. And we were included in everything from Newsweek to the National Enquirer. It was pretty hysterical. So for a couple of minutes, Max was the most famous turtle on the planet. And I was his mom. So again, another one of mine and Adrian's great stories. Before I go today, just want to remind you of those 3 things I talked about in the middle. I want to hear from you. I want you to ask me questions. Ask me everything you ever wanted to know about turning 40, about this transition, and about mine or my guests' stories. Get on my email list. And if there's anything you'd like to see or hear more of on the podcast, I want to hear your suggestions. And you can do all of that on my website, 40drinks.com. Don't forget to spell out the word 40. All right. Next week, you are going to meet Rita Bliven, who told me, I'm not in a full-blown midlife crisis, but I'm flirting with one. As a baby, Rita experienced an international parental kidnapping that created extreme avoidant attachment issues, which left her struggling to trust others, lacking a sense of self, and with a fear of intimacy. She also suffered from anxiety and depression. So much of Rita's adult life has been spent learning about attachment theory, attachment styles, the traumas that create attachment issues, and attachment healing. Today, she's happily married, loves being a stepmom, and is reconnected to both sides of her family. This is a story you don't want to miss. So, I'll see you next week. The 40 Drinks podcast is produced and presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications.